studying psychiatric disorders or understanding psychiatric disorders is really, really important to all of us. And this is not just since the pandemic, where we saw that mental health problems were rising a lot during the lockdowns across the globe, but also psychiatric illnesses are extremely widespread in the population. We know that at least a quarter of all people are actually currently having a mental health issue. And mental health problems are not just something minor that you carry around with, but they are actually extremely impairing and affect well-being and life satisfaction to a tremendous extent. So, for example, we know that the WHO, the World Health Organization, puts many of the different mental health disorders amongst their top of the impairing disorders in terms of how chronic they are, in terms of how impairing they are, how people lose their job, how they lose years of age, and so on and so forth. So mental health is an extremely important aspect of medicine. However, we often tend to not pay enough attention or not put enough effort into understanding them. And just to pick one case, which for example is depression, which is the most common of all disorders, we know that 300 million are at this moment affected worldwide. This is a huge number. And we know that 1 in 4 people throughout their lives once suffers from depression. This is a massive number. So it is very common and is actually very likely to affect us or our family at some point in our lives. And this is not just lowering our life quality or our productivity, but it also really is a cause of death. So we know that about 800,000 people per year die from suicide, which is often triggered by a depression. And this is actually much more common if you look at specific age ranges, such as late adolescence, early adulthood, so between 15 and 29, where it's the second leading cause of death just after accidents. And so there is a huge push towards understanding what is causing these psychiatric disorders. And because we know that psychiatric disorders are essentially disorders of the brain, there has been a big effort of trying to understand what is going on in the brain, what is going wrong in the brain that drives the emergence of a certain mental health disorder. And so the goal really of what we call computational psychiatry, but generally psychiatric research, is to understand which mechanisms, what is happening in the brain that leads to the emergence of a psychiatric illness. And this is not a new approach. So understanding how psychiatric illnesses are related to the brain is actually rather old. And some of you might recognize this fellow here on the right-hand side. This is, as you might have guessed, Sigmund Freud, who's kind of the founder of psychoanalysis and literally the father of contemporary psychiatry. And already he started trying to understand the brain basis of psychiatric illnesses. And in fact, what you can see here on the left-hand side is an early drawing of Freud's, and before he became famous with his psychoanalysis, he actually did a lot of neuroscience, and he was drawing here different nerve cells. And he tried to understand how psychiatric disorders emerge from brain dysfunction. But after a few years, he gave up, as we now understand, very frustratedly, saying that all attempts of localizing brain processes and brain illnesses have failed entirely. Well, if we think back, that's not very surprising, because at the time when Freud investigated the brain, they didn't even know that there is something like a neuron. This is a couple of decades before Cajal's discovery of the neuron. So it was very likely that the brain was still like much less understood than nowadays. But nowadays, 150 years have passed, and we have figured out a great deal more. And we have new techniques that allow us to really investigate brain processes. And one of them is functional magnetic resonance imaging, which allows us to study brain processes and brain structure in vivo. So we can just take any human being and put them in the scanner, and we can see which processes are active when they're thinking and when they're computing specific processes. And so this really has been hailed as the holy grail for psychiatrists about 20 years ago, hoping that by being able to look at how people think, we can then discover how people think differently if they're suffering from mental health illness. And this is exactly the thing that people try to do, so to try to connect the disorders to the brain illnesses. And indeed, there were some early successes. So for example, people have put people in schizophrenia patients in a scanner and that heard voices, and they could find that when they heard voices that their auditory cortex was more active. And so it was really believed that we can fix it very quickly. However, there has been a lot of work going into understanding MRI in psychiatry, and here's just numbers of publications that came out. And so we've done a lot of work in the last 20 years to understand that. But if you go into our psychiatric manuals, so the manuals that describe or tell us how to diagnose a certain illness, then you will be quite surprised that there is no mentioning of the brain whatsoever. So there is not a description that says, well, then look at the ventromedial prefrontal cortex activation, and that will tell you whether someone has depression or not. And to some extent, we have, as a community, failed to really pin down the mechanisms in the brain that go awry in mental health disorders. And this is due to two key problems, which I will tell you how we can possibly overcome that using computational psychiatry and computational modeling. And one is that we are trying to bridge a gigantic gap. So on the one hand, we have the brain, this really intricate and complex system, which we still don't fully understand, but we know a little bit about the computational mechanisms that underlie it. And on the other hand, we have the psychiatric disorders, which are judged on and labeled on a very abstract level. So the way someone receives a mental health disorder is that they see a clinician, which then goes through an abstract list of symptom criteria which need to be fulfilled. And so really bridging the gap between this sophisticated fine-grained computational machine and these very abstract descriptions might be a rather challenging one, especially if we want to acknowledge that these very abstract impairments could maybe arise due to lots of different impairments in the brain, which all just look very similar when you assess them in a clinical interview. And so what we've come to use over the last couple of years is to try to use computational modeling to bridge the gap between brain function and psychiatric illness, because we, at least in part, understand how the brain is computing certain aspects of behavior and cognition, and because we can use computational modeling to relate to that. And in the remainder of the time, I want to illustrate some of the approaches that we've been doing, and I'll focus on one specific symptom and one specific aspect of it to illustrate how we use computational modeling. And I will talk about indecisiveness in the context of obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD, which is one specific psychiatric illness. And OCD is mainly characterized by two key symptoms. One is obsessions, which are intrusive thoughts or images, which are things that come to your mind and which are extremely distressing and anxiety provoking. They're often evolved around serious harm or death of yourself or of loved ones, but can be expressed in very different aspects of it. And because this is really anxiety provoking and distressful, OCD patients then often carry out what we call compulsions, which are repetitive acts or behaviors which help to alleviate these obsessions and anxiety. So the most prominent and widely known is, for example, the fear of contamination, that you might have caught some dangerous virus, and in consequence, you wash your hands over and over again. And this is really to an extreme extent. So OCD patients spend hours and hours a day washing their hands, for example, and it's really, really debilitating. Interestingly, we know very little about the mechanisms underlying OCD, even though it is very common. It affects about 1 in 30 people, and it's believed to be one of the most common psychiatric illnesses, therefore, and is also very impairing because it's often chronic in its disorder. But even though it is so common, we spend very little money on it, so it's massively underfunded, and that's also what you see in terms of the publications, which are much less common than other disorders such as depression. All right, but OCD is also characterized by one specific symptom, which we know very little about, which is that many patients suffer from a pervasive indecisiveness. That means they have really difficulties making decisions and making up their mind. And this is often also present outside of the specific obsessions and compulsions. And to give you one little example here, this is a patient who came in the other day, and we asked her to fill out a questionnaire, and she couldn't decide whether something applied to her occasionally or often. And so she created quite creatively a new category called sometimes, which solves her decisiveness problem. Obviously, it didn't really help us because we can't just introduce new categories to standardized questionnaires. So far, we usually assess indecisiveness just by, as I said, very on an abstract level, we ask them in an interview, how decisive or how indecisive are you? How difficult is it for you to choose between toothpastes? And to better understand the mechanisms, we ideally want to have a more task-based behavioral marker of that so that we can use computational modeling. And this indecisiveness, or its or its more technical term, which is kind of the information gathering, how much information you gather before you make a decision, is a very common and actually quite a substantial problem, which we have to solve all the time. So for example, if you have to go and buy and use toothpaste at a grocery shop, then you can be easily overwhelmed because there are hundreds of different toothpaste, and which one is the best? Well, I usually don't know. So I could go there and look at the ingredients for each of the toothpaste. And I could then even go to the internet and see, well, are there clinical trials that prove that certain ingredients are better than others? And so I can spend hours and hours figuring out the best toothpaste, and maybe I will end up with the best toothpaste, but I might have spent a whole day of in front of the toothpaste, which I could have spent much more optimally. However, the flip side of it, if you're too decisive, maybe that's also not good. For example, if you want to buy a new house, then probably you shouldn't just put in an offer for the first house that comes up on your mind. Maybe you want to have a look at the condition of the house, or see whether the floor plans actually match your requirements. And so to capture their indecisiveness or their information gathering, we developed a behavioral task where we ask patients and controls to tell us whether the majority of these 25 cards, which are flipped in the beginning, are yellow or blue. And obviously at the beginning, we know very little, but we allow them to open as many cards as they want until they feel certain enough. And once they feel certain enough, then they can make a decision. And so we can use just the amount of cards they open before they make a decision as a proxy for understanding their indecisiveness. And we manipulate how costly it is to open cards, which should change how much they gather information. And this is a very simple behavioral task where we can capture information gathering very easily. but to really understand the processes that are going on in someone's mind, we want to use a computational model. And once you try to derive an information, a computational model, you actually realize that this is not particularly trivial. Because at any point in time, you can make 3 decisions. You can either declare for yellow, you can declare for blue, or you can continue sampling. And what you can compute is the likelihood of a certain color forming the majority given what you've currently seen. And by doing that, you can actually calculate what we call the action value for a certain action. So your action value, so how good it is to choose a yellow, to declare for yellow, is your personal likelihood of this forming the majority times the amount of points you win if you're correct, minus what you lose if you're wrong. And so you can compute that for both the declaring for yellow and blue, and we use that using Bayesian models. However, the slightly more tricky bit of these computational models is to assign a value to the non-decision option. So what is your value if you don't declare, because there is no direct outcome? And what you have to do there is you have to project yourself into the future. You have to think, well, what if I don't declare right now? What if I open 2 more cards? How good will my decision be at that point, given what I've currently revealed? And we can use that using back propagation to compute the value of that of continuing sampling. And we can then use this model to compute optimal behavior. We can see how would we optimally solve this task, and we can then compare it to the human's behavior. And what we can see is that in the condition where there is no cost associated with opening cards, an optimal agent would open almost all of the cards before declaring, whereas if it's costly, the agent would open very few information, because then the gathering more information soon becomes more costly than the benefit of the information. And we can compare it to human behavior, and we can see that humans are terrible at it. We open too few cards when it's for free, we open too many when it's wrong. But then we can go back to our computational model and see, how do we have to change the computational model to actually match human behavior? How can we capture really the human behavior? And what turns out to be extremely important in this model is a parameter or an aspect of the model which I haven't talked about, which is the subjective costs of sampling. And what this means is that when we gather information, at the beginning, these costs, so the effort that it costs us to gather more information is very low, whereas over time that becomes more and more costly, which makes us decide much more rapidly as we go along. And we call this an urgency signal, which by using computational modeling, we've shown that this is escalating in a non-linear way, which means that when we start the opening, the first few cards comes almost for free, whereas then later on it's really costly and it's draining a lot of energy. So we're unlikely to open many more cards when we've already opened a bunch. And so by using that, we can actually very nicely capture human behavior. So now going back to the OCD patients, see, are they actually behaving differently? And indeed, we see that OCD patients are more indecisive also on this task, so they open more cards before they make a decision, and that this very nicely correlates with this metric of indecisiveness in the task very nicely correlates with the interview-based assessment of these patients. So how we would usually label them in a traditional way, which shows that we have an ecological validity of the task. We can then go and take this behavior and fit the models to our participants and see which aspect of this model is different, so which cognitive process is differing. And interestingly, these subjective costs that I just talked about seem to be the key driver of why OCD gather more information compared to controls, and we can show that these subjective costs arise much later on in the game than in controls. And now you can say, well, this is interesting, but it's kind of a small sample, and there are lots of issues if you use patient samples. For example, many of them have medication and so on, and they have comorbidities and so on and so forth. So we wanted to replicate this effect, and we took a dimensional approach where we believe that every one of us has some traits of OCD, and we all live on a spectrum, and patients are probably the most extreme on the spectrum. And so what we did is we sampled people which are either very high on OCD spectrum or very low, but none of them are patients. And we matched them for all kinds of things, such as anxiety and IQ and so on and so forth, from a very big database that we have, which ensures that if we feel a difference, then this is mainly driven by OCD symptoms. And we had them do the same task, and indeed we replicate the findings. So again, we see that also in this task, OCD high compulsive subjects opened more cards, and indeed if we pool the data, we can show that this is a very nicely linear increase along the spectrum, with OCD patients opening more cards than high compulsives. And again, we can then go back to the computational model, and we show that it's again these subjective costs which are the driving factor. Because OCD is usually arising during early adolescence, we're then interested in the development of that, and that's related to Yukiya's talk of understanding, well, is there a change during development, and maybe is that driving it? And so we looked at that, at this indecisiveness during development in pre-pubertal and adolescence, and indeed we see this huge drop in information gathering between children and adolescents, and that's exactly the time also when OCD arises. So really suggesting maybe that this is a trigger for, or maybe an aberrant development might be driving this. And last but not least, we're really interested in understanding the neural mechanisms and the neurotransmitters, so the brain chemicals which are related and change information gathering. And so we looked at dopamine and noradrenaline, two very prominent neurotransmitters, which I think Michael Frank will talk about a bit more as well in a second. And indeed, we could show that if we block noradrenaline functioning, we could actually make people the opposite of indecisive. So we could make people more decisive when we block their functioning. And again, we showed that this is affecting the same parameter as we see impaired in OCD participants. And lastly, we also looked at serotonin functioning, and we used SSRIs, which boost serotonin functioning, and we can show the opposite. So if we boost serotonin functioning, we can actually make people more indecisive. And interestingly, when we then look at the computational parameters, we see that this specific neurotransmitter is affecting a different process compared to the noradrenaline, which matches the other theories of serotonin. Now, lastly, we thought, well, these are all small and interesting studies, but one of the key challenges is to address the heterogeneity across the population, but also in OCD patients. And to really be able to use any of this in the clinics, we would have to show that this is easily applicable on the large scale. And therefore, with my postdoc, Vasilisa Skvotsova, we developed the Brain Explorer app that you might have downloaded just now, where we implemented this and a bunch of other cognitive tasks for every phone, and any person worldwide can play it. And by doing that, we gather a huge data set going into big data, where we can actually look at much more intricate questions. And by now we have over 10,000 people, so we have millions of decisions already now. And this is how the task looks on the app. And you can actually play it. It's a treasure hunt game. You can probably play around with it at the very beginning. And we also therefore can span and relate that to other cognitive functions. And we've already collected data from across the globe, as you can see, and this really allows us to address completely new questions and at a completely different scales. So for example, I showed you the decrease in information gathering during adolescence, and we can replicate this here. But we can also see that this is a much more complex pattern where we have a U-shaped curve across lifespan. And now we're digging into it. And by using these new digital technologies, we can really take the neuroscience out of the laboratory into the whole wild world and address these questions in a much more realistic, naturalistic environment. And with this having said, I would like to just summarize. I hope I was able to show you that we can use information gathering to capture indecisiveness in OCD and to therefore overcome the very abstract descriptions that we've been using so far. We can use computational modeling to really capture which aspects and which mechanisms are underlying that. And we can trace them not only in development, but also look at how neurotransmitters are aberrant and also which brain regions might be involved in that. And with this having said, I would like to thank my whole group who's done all the work, my funders for funding my research. If you're keen on playing that, please go ahead. We're grateful for any data. Tell it to your friends and families. And I'm happy to take some questions now. Thank you.